To a Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Dr. Anders Mellbourn, who is director of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. He's a former editor-in-chief of Dagens Nyheter, the leading morning daily in Sweden, where he spent 20 years in various positions. He's chairman of the Stint Foundation, the Swedish Foundation for International Cooperation and Research and Higher Education. He is a regular commentator and columnist on international affairs in various Swedish media. Dr. Mellbourn, welcome to Berkeley.
It's good to be here. Thanks a lot.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in the south of Sweden, which makes me very proud, but it's only visible in my passport. Then I grew up in Stockholm and in a teacher's family, and with a great interest in public affairs, I would say.
And looking back, how specifically did your parents shape your thinking about the world? Just pointed you in that direction, or?
No, I think the interesting thing, my father was a professor of German, which of course was sensitive in the way in the 40s, 50s. He got his PhD in the 40s in German, but he had also he was very active in the Low Church movements, and he had these popular contacts in Germany, and he was very committed to establishing contact between the new democratic forces in Germany after the war, especially among teachers. And he was a co-founder of an European organizations of teachers that met to create understanding after the catastrophe of the Second World War and Nazism and fascism. So I think that gave me some kind of idealist interest in international affairs, also with our church connections with missions interests in Africa and things like that. So I think that was probably my basic baggage when it comes to international affairs.
And where were you educated?
I was educated in Stockholm, basically, and I have my PhD from the University of Stockholm, which at that time and at many times has been a political science department very close to decision making in one way, because it's the university in the capital, and many of the professors were also directly involved in public affairs or in government as consultants, and many of us who took our degrees were also had ideas not only to stay in academia, and I look at my friends who were teachers assistants at that time. I mean, one is now the Speaker of the Swedish Parliament, former Minister of Defense. Another one is the CEO of one of the leading Swedish companies, and others have been in different positions as state secretaries in government, and I have another colleague who was also editor-in-chief of the paper I was with, Dagens Nyheter. So this was also I think a rather special group. I mean, this was the 60s. Then I'm also very influenced by travels. As I say, I traveled in Germany and England with my parents in the 50s as a child, because they had summer courses for teachers in language. But I also visited the US quite early, and I had I won a competition when I was 15 for a seminar on the UN arranged by the Youth Forum of the UN in the early 60s by a now defunct New York paper, the New York Mirrors, which brought me to New York when I was 15, I think, for the first time.
That must have been exciting.
But then I had a college year, 65, 66, after Swedish high school, and I came back with my graduate work to the University of Michigan, where I met many people that I still are in contact, that I'm still in contact with among American political scientists. And my dissertation, even if it was in Stockholm, was part of a comparative project ran out of Michigan at that time. So I feel this was comparative bureaucracy, really, the roles of politics and administration among civil servants. This theme is the civil service a neutral servant, or is it a political servant, or is more technocratic? And that was a major interest of, I mean, it's still a prevalent theme, of course, in public policy. So in many ways, I am more, if I know anything academically, it's more comparative government than international relations, even if I'm now more directly into international relations.
And any events from that period of your formative years that stand out? I mean, the Vietnam War, the revolts of '68, or really the Cold War. What sticks in your mind?
Well, I think the Cold War was very decisive. I remember, to begin with, and the Vietnam War, but I'm more anecdotal with the Cold War. I remember the first time we started having polls, opinion polls around elections and projections, you know, was, I think, the election of 1960. And they obviously had their calculation wrong the first time, because the Swedish Communist Party was getting 15%, I think, according to the first projection when, you know, polls had closed. And I think I was 14 years old, and I told my parents, if this is going to stay, I have to leave, or something like that. But at the same time, then, of course, but I mean, this was a more of a, as I said, my setting was very liberal. I mean, it, in the Nordic sense, not social democratic, but liberal, non-socialist left wing, so to speak. And then when I went to the US in '65, '66, for my college year, which was on the East Coast, both I was in New York and then in Washington, because there was this Washington semesters that small colleges have. Of course, I mean, I was very, I mean, the Vietnam War debate and the discussion, of course, had much influence on me. But I think I was so I was also quite I think the impact was very much from the American opposition to the war, rather than to the more Marxist discussion that developed in Europe among European students. I remember when I got back, I always tried to say that, I mean, this is an American thing to be against the war. This is not to be against the US. So I think emotionally rather close to the American generation of the late 60s. And of course there were many exaggerations in that as well, and maybe I'm more skeptical in many ways now. I heard John Kerry answering these questions on the NBC the other day, and of course but basically I think this is of course a formative experience also. And I think when if you allow me, I'll go on talking. I mean, when I then moved into journalism in the early 70s, when I had started my PhD studies, and then I was recruited by Dagens Nyheter, the leading paper, to write editorials on foreign affairs, because of contacts and things like that, the way it worked. I think one of the ideas that I tried to pursue in the 70s, and which you in today's perspective can discuss, was that looking at the poor world, the third world movements, liberation movements still against colonialism, I think that it was important to support them to find a possible way between the superpowers. I think at that time it was also a service to democracy to try to find a solution. I mean, because the middle way, which is in retrospect sometimes criticized as being, you know, not having stood up in the Cold War confrontation enough. I don't think that, which is also criticism against Sweden in certain circles, which I don't find really fair, because I think there was a case for this, that showing, and we can see that, for example, with the ANC in South Africa, which many thought was, and it was to a certain extent, an instrument of Moscow communism. I mean, the Communist Party was very Moscow-oriented and was very strong within the ANC. But some of us, and I mean, of course, there were more prominent people in that than myself, much more prominent. But I mean, I think the idea that showing that a Western capitalist country could support the basic cause of liberation from colonial rule, and also then from racism, was important. Otherwise, it would have been a catastrophe if the Cold War result in the Third World would have been that all these countries lined up with the Soviet side, which of course they did on certain UN votes, and there's on many crucial votes. But I remember with the revolution in Nicaragua, for example, and the Sandinistas, would they really be Cuban, or would there be a chance for something else? I think something that I was rather interested in, which made both friends but also enemies, both on the left and the right in the Swedish public at that time.
But I get the sense that you're saying that in some ways, at times, the Western side, dominated by the U.S., could be its own enemy to but by focusing primarily on the conflict with the Soviet Union,
exactly,
and not addressing the realities and possibilities on the ground as people, sought their national independence. Yeah.
Yes, I think so, and I think that happened, and I think in that perspective, it was important that certain smaller countries in Europe and others also tried to show that you don't have to be totally anti-Western in the future. I mean, we have a better alternative than the Soviet-style communism that now tempts you because you want to be against your old enemy.
Help us understand why you said you were offered a position and that led you into journalism. What was it about the possibilities in looking at these issues as a journalist and as an editorial and writer and columnist, as opposed to pursuing at this time early in your career an academic way of approaching these problems?
Yes, it's a good question. I think the answer is, of course, coming from a middle-class teacher's family, it was natural for me to stay on and start graduate studies, because, I mean, that was the background. If you were good in school, you should try to get a PhD and pursue academic studies, so to speak. That was, I think, the norm, which I also accepted. I was not tempted of going into business school or law school or something like in that practice, but then I think I had always been interested in journalism, writing articles for student publications and things like that. And I think there is a with me. What attracted me was, of course, the idea to work with many things, maybe superficially, but concentrated at one time, and then see the result quickly. That is, of course, the great joy of journalism, that you can see the result of your work the day afterwards, when you are a writer or a copy editor or something like that. I mean, you see the paper only a couple of hours later, what you did. And I think that, and also my temperament, maybe, I mean, looking at the academic world, it would mean writing a book every 3 or 4 years, sitting in the library, and I think I did not have, and I do not, and I still do not, I think, have the real stamina to stay with one theme very deeply for several years, which I think you have to do in academia. But I always try to keep touch with it, and as, of course, where I'm now working, it's more in the academic world and it's very little in the journalistic world. But also when I was in the news, I had occasional lectures and met with people and it was one way of keeping up with my academic contacts, not the least here at Berkeley, because some of my professors had pretty good relations at Berkeley, and when they came to Stockholm when I was at the paper, I was invited to meet them and I interviewed them and things like that. Yeah. So I think among my journalistic colleagues, I was always seen as kind of an academic practicing journalism, even if they supported my way even to the editorship. I mean, I had a certain profile there compared to my friends and colleagues in the paper.
You mentioned that you as a young scholar, you had worked on the relationship between bureaucracy and politics. I'm curious what your thoughts are about the positive role that the press makes to policy debates and how that role has evolved. Is it clarifying the debate where, in addition obviously to the news, but what is it? Is it the clarifying of the issues that are presented, say for example in foreign policy, that is its most important and useful contribution? And has that role evolved, do you think, over time?
Well, I think that if you look at print journalism, which is of course is my experience, and maybe that is now the declining part of journalism, but it is the starting point of journalism is of course print journalism and political journalism. And the news aside, and of course I've spent quite a lot, my last 10 years in journalism was very much in the news department, and even more than that. But I mean, if you look at the development of newspaper content at quality newspapers, they have of course moved quite a lot from news to commentary analysis. And the rationale being you get now the news directly through the first radio, then television, and of course now through the net. So you have this immediate access to sources, and you see things when they happen. And so, if in order to stay relevant, the papers have to stress analysis and more deeper feature stories and things like that. And of course, I think that has basically raised the quality of journalism, or did at least until rather recently. I think sometimes you are too pessimistic about that. If you look at the remaining quality papers, they still have high quality in many areas of this. Then there are other complications. I would say, and this may be a very internal discussion in the press, that this emphasis of giving commentary is now to me a problem because it's also getting into news journalism. I mean, in the news media. In the sense that you get the commentary before you get the facts, which I found more and more distressing, especially when I do not work in the area any longer. And I'm, so to speak, if I switch on the radio in the morning, I want to hear the results of American primaries or something like that. And I immediately get the commentary that Kerry was strengthened by this and this and this. Okay, I know that people need that, but I need the figures because I know perhaps a little more than Anders. I think many of us, and there are many other areas. And you get the commentary before you really get the facts, and you force perhaps the consumer or the reader or the viewer and the listener to take your analysis. And it's not supplementary to the facts, because I think in order to be relevant, commentary has to help the reader or the viewer to form an own opinion of its own, and not to give a full package. So I think there are also, I now see kickbacks to this deepening of journalism, that maybe we should, or they should go. It's an interesting Freudian slip. I said we, but that they should go back to more direct reporting as well, because you still feel you want the full story.
Yeah. Let's talk a little now about the role that the press has played in this. We're essentially in a new international era after 9/11, and this may be a good time, before we actually get into the nature of the threat and so on, to talk a little about the kind of grade you would give journalists generally in the United States, in Britain, in your own country, in talking about helping us understand better the problem of terrorism, the problems involved in the Iraq War, and so on. I mean, there's a whole new set of problems, and the press has to assume a more important role. And is it a problem that you're not getting the facts in that kind of reporting generally, do you think? Or
if we should blame, or if we would blame the media, I think we could perhaps say that they are not independent enough. I think their strengths and weaknesses reflect the strengths and weaknesses in the analysis that the policymakers have. I think they have been. I mean, if you look at the European press, perhaps it's overemphasizing the kind of structural aspects of this is a response to poverty and things like that. But this rather the more simple version of that has also been refuted. I think there has been a quite lively debate both on so-called cultural pages or feuilleton pages in the German sense, and op-ed pages, and also in reporting that is decently reflect the complexities. But of course, and you could of course say that if the terrorist threat of the magnitude we saw on 9/11 was underestimated by the US administration, which it obviously was, and regardless what you think about Richard Clarke's book, and I mean, of course, that was shared by the press, and I think the terrorist, I mean, trying to see into the future is still a problem with the press and with the media on the whole. But I would say the problem sometimes, I think, is a gap between daily reporting and this more commentary. That sometimes the questions from the deeper discussions get into the press conferences in some way, or are forgotten in the pursuit of daily events. And there of course, I think that, and this is not a very original view, that I mean the development now of news journalism kind of coming out with news stories every half hour, I mean, or if you are on the net, it's continuous, makes it hard to get, you see, I mean, it's really the problem, you see so many trees, so you never see the forest. I mean, and this is an observation that I guess I share with many others. But I know you have this discussion here, is the press to the left or to the right or something like that, and which you have in all countries. And I think people who are in the media tend to be more leftist, not because of any manipulation or grand conspiracy, but it just, if you are less interested in the kind of power positions within the bureaucracy, or especially in business, or if you are a little more bohemian in your lifestyle and you are open to ideas, it's usually related. Many of the qualities, and you taking certain risks, are related to the qualities that are good in journalism. But in many ways, I still lack some of the more, when looking at the Iraqi developments, and I mean, if you look at the full picture, most of the questions are there, but are they there at the very right moment? That I think is a problem.
Let's talk about have you put on your hat as an international relations person now, and talk a little about how the world was changed by 9/11. What from your perspective, and do you see as the nature of the new threats posed by Al-Qaeda and events such as 9/11?
I think, because we had talked about the new threats after the Cold War during the 90s, and we had mentioned terrorism and all those things, and we had experienced quite a lot of terrorism. Because in Europe we have, that's another, because we had quite a lot of terrorism during the Cold War. I mean, Germany, Italy in the 70s and the early 80s and so on. But I mean, what I found the most striking thing, of course, with 9/11 is that terrorism took the magnitude of a military attack. I mean, that the attacks in New York and in New York primarily, basically, I mean, it was like a blitz night during the Second World War, which meant that the difference between warfare and terrorism is now very blurred, because the size of the action that can be taken has now warlike dimension. And of course, the other thing was that the United States was attacked on its own soil. This at the height of its power, this paradox, when the US was seen as totally dominating as the superpower, it was vulnerable on its own soil. And I mean, even Hawaii was not a state at the time of Pearl Harbor. So I guess those are, I mean, maybe there are certain 19th century parallels, but in modern history, and I think that is, of course, what is so obvious for you, but I mean, for us observing the US, living with the US, having our relations with the US, of course, that's something that we have to realize, that that's very different, because America has exercised a superpower position by buying on other continents, and this idea that this was an island of bliss, the continent isolated by two oceans and so on, and I think those fundamentals are of course very different. But saying that, I would in one way, and I know many people in Europe do not share my view, accept the language that this is now a war on terrorism. I mean, others say, no, terrorism is still a police thing. But of course, if this is a war on terrorism, it's a war that has to be pursued by other means. That has even been said by the Bush administration several times. But the practice, of course, has been falling back to very traditional wars and a new belief that war is possible. And of course the first success in Afghanistan and of course the first months of success in Iraq a year ago reinforced this view that maybe you could use war now when there is the threat of nuclear war is not there in the same way with the superpower of confrontation. And I think that is perhaps a folly or one of the dangerous lanes now that we have to get back from again.
And is this because it's a state-centric view of the world and the causes of terrorist acts, that it has to emanate from a state that is failing or it has malintentions? Is that?
Yeah, I think the response is of course state-centric, as you see. Yeah. At the same time, the UN was very flexible, as you know, just after 9/11, saying that a terrorist attack by a non-statal actor could now be seen as a threat to international peace and security, which was not the language of the original language of the UN Charter. So, I mean, we have realized now that this is, but our behavior is very state-oriented. And I'm, of course, in my opinion, in Iraq, of course, it's dead wrong, because, I mean, Iraq was a problem, but not as relating to the terrorist situation, as far, I mean, which I think is a rather common viewpoint, although it was not the viewpoint of the White House at the time of the war.
What is the basis, the foundation of this new set of threats? Do you buy the notion that we're in a clash of civilization or a clash of ideas between the West and parts of the Islamic world?
That is, of course, obviously part of it, but I think the major, I tend to think that that it is some kind of attack against the more universalist, globalized world that we have seen developing so fast in the 90s, and in many ways so successfully. Of course, it has solved quite some poverty problems, and it has created an awful lot of wealth, not the least here, but also in Northern Europe, I mean, at least at the same time. And it, of course, it has meant a tremendous change in Asia, China, and other countries. But what we are living through is this, I mean, the globalized development. And of course, I see, which is trying to be where the US is the dominating power, but it was, in the 90s, I think the image was that we had one dominating power, and it was rather benign, to use that language, which is popular now also in the analysis. And I think I've said in a short essay that I found the attacks of 9/11 being more on America as it was conceived under Clinton in the 90s than against Bush, because it was really, and which makes the situation so complicated when we now talk bringing the UN in on making this a multilateral effort. It's true, we should do that, but in one way that shows that most parts of the world are united in a system where we believe there are gains for us all. We're still trying to work, but it is dominated by America, and there are certain forces, of course, and they, I think, use religion or rediscover religion in this, but its basic people who have not are part of the system. It's not the most pure. We knew that the people in the planes on 9/11 were had engineering degrees from Germany, or
the terrorists.
the terrorists. I mean, the active terrorists. But it's some kind of disenchantment that we are not getting our part of it, and then you are open to apocalyptic ideas and things like that, which makes it very frightening.
The irony you're finding here is that the emphasis on soft power in the Clinton administration and a globalized world, transforming the world economically and culturally and so on, is what, in a way, generates the opposition to that world and creates the threat.
Exactly. I mean, which frightens me. I mean, because even more in one way. When I said this was not then against the Bush administration, I meant that the Bush administration, at least when it came in its rhetoric, was, you know, we had to limit the American national interest.
Yes.
There is overstretch. We should only. There was a certain retreatist rhetoric, and I mean that was. But then, and that which was different, and now we got this, I would say, overstretch in military terms instead, as a late response then afterwards. But that is really what frightens me, I think, that in one way the terrorist attacks are against the new world that many of us with views, liberal views and views to the left of center find attractive. I mean, we see many problems in it, that it doesn't solve the inequalities in many ways, but we still believe that there are new chances, both to get growth and prosperity for many people, and that there are groups who find their values or their positions threatened by this, and that this globalized world of soft power and soft relations is, of course, vulnerable to small individual attacks, and as we have seen, and it doesn't need all that, and so you have this tremendous contrast between the power in the system and its vulnerability to attack, even by people with, of course, sophistication that they have learned within this system, but still not that many resources.
Now, what then this new threat in the context of the alienation and the reaction created by what we see as positive forces in globalization, civil society, freedom, has been turned on its head. Now, what do you make of the threat posed by terrorist cells, rogue states, failed states? I mean, talk a little about this nexus between the old state system and its failures and this new opponent who has mastered technologies and who doesn't have an address, as Kissinger used to say in the past.
No, which I think is good. And of course, we really don't know this. Now we have had this emphasis on fail and failing state because, of course, we have the case of Afghanistan, which is, of course, interesting. Many people don't remember, but it's true. I mean, it was not a state except recognized, but the Taliban government was not recognized by the UN. I mean, and there had been resolutions against Afghanistan as a source of terrorism, even in the late 90s. We tend to forget that. But, and of course that was a haven, then a training ground. I mean, that's obvious. I mean, that certain, but I don't think that all failed states, I think it's even dangerous if we think that if we get at all failed states in some way, we will get this under control. I mean, state failure is basically a phenomenon in Africa. And there I think it has a direct relation probably to HIV/AIDS, I mean, and the diffusion of that, which is of course also a threat. But if we talk about the terrorist threat and its connection to Sierra Leone or Liberia, and I don't see that's so obvious, and there could be some problems in the analysis. And I mean, if we take the case of Iraq, of course, Iraq was an abusive state that has now was made failed by the invasion. It was not a failed state under Saddam Hussein. It was a very controlled state. I mean, that was part of the problem.
Yeah.
It was also a state with limited sovereignty after 91, with the inspection regimes and the sanctions and the oil for food program. It was really an interesting case of limited sovereignty, and where I think, in my view, containment worked. I mean, it was not good for the Iraqi people. That is true, and
it dealt with the security problem.
But it dealt with the security problem. And now, after intervention, we now have the security problem.
Now you're suggesting that the new threat is a phenomena that merges out of globalization, and that it would be an error to confuse that with the kind of violence and decay and oppositional groups that you may have in particular settings and examples of failing and failed states in, say, Africa. The Bush administration clearly is saying the two are linked.
Yeah.
And wants to assert that we should be acting all over the world and treating these various oppositional groups as one.
Yes, and I think that is one of the things that I find hard with the Bush administration analysis, and I think many Europeans do as well. At the same time, of course, this has created certain good things. This, I mean, you know, have a rather extensive anti-AIDS, HIV/AIDS program run by the Bush administration in Africa, which I think is a very good thing, and the administration must get credit for that. But I do not see that, I mean, and that is part of a new threat, but it's not combating the terrorist threat. And I think the problem with, of course, and now going back when we said the concept of war on terrorism, that I said in one way I could accept, because I think terrorism now has warlike aspects, is now using, as we were talking about this previously, about the old machinery, and there is this there is no exit strategy from them. There is no definition of what is in it, and what it, if it is as broad as the president says, it will be very hard to get out of it, and it will be, you can find rationale for doing very different things that do not keep together. And I think this is a challenge that, it's true that you cannot know where it will get, but you have to be much more sophisticated with that. I'm not trying to say that I know the answers, and perhaps cautious and careful, and live with some of the threats, and trying to limit them. But of course, it will not be credible to put the whole world, or the civilized world, whatever, or the Western world on war footing against this for decades. I don't think that will work for us.
You're suggesting that the formula that the Bush administration is using does not offer a defined universe. The borders of where
your language is much better here.
Yeah, but the where we have to act is indeterminate, on the one hand, but then that requires intelligence, evidence about where the threat is, and as we know from the build-up and then the Iraq War, the evidence that the administration was acting on was not valid, basically, about whether there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which suggests an error that could be repeated elsewhere.
Yes, I mean, that is, if you are going to go for preemption, of course, intelligence is extremely important, because then you base something on, you know, something that is not openly there. Or, I mean, okay, I mean, if you maybe you could have had, if you had a very strong counterpower, you would have been able to mobilize against Nazi Germany in 1937 or something like that, when there were so many signs of and maybe it would have, if you had the strength, I mean, that could be the case for preemption. But the preemption we are talking about here, of course, requires very, very sophisticated intelligence. So I think the intelligence is one of the real complicated points. But and otherwise, I mean, the war on terrorism problem is this no exit strategy. And I mean, with the lessons of Vietnam and the Secretary Powell with this, that you have to decide when you start a military action that you have an exit strategy. And there has been nothing now with Iraq, which is one of the real scary things at the moment. And then, of course, I think the problem with the war analogy on terrorism is, of course, that terrorism is a method. It's not like the Soviet Union. It's not an alternative society that wants to compete, but it's a tactic. Rather better the word than the method.
Now, how does this new world after 9/11, how does this impact on a small country like Sweden and its foreign policy? In what ways does this changed world require, if at all, Sweden to rethink its foreign policy?
I think that it has fundamental impact for us in the sense, and of course it had already started with the end of the Cold War. I said, I'm talking about my own ideas, writing editorials in the 70s, when we also then talked about Swedish foreign policy at the time. There was a case for this in-between action in order to not, without being unfaithful to democratic ideals, saying that there is something in between that you could develop and work and help people getting into the Soviet trap, if you like to call it that. Of course, this role is more complicated when there is only one superpower and when there are no confrontations like that. We are more definitely into the Western structure, whether we are members of NATO or not. And we have, of course, joined the EU, and we are now trying to learn to see that an attack on Madrid is as an attack on us, because we are members of the EU. We are working in a larger context. And I think we have to realize that we cannot isolate ourselves from the threat. And I admittedly, there could have been in the Swedish tradition also a certain feeling that, okay, we are, since we are standing on the side, we are not that open to some of the attacks. I think maybe Stockholm is not on the hit list as high up, but with the mobility, we know that terrorists in certain areas have been living in Sweden. We are part of the system, and we have to see what is our contribution there. And maybe we have certain strengths in civil society developments and conflict prevention ideas that we have worked with, and we have to now contribute them in a wider context. And also, and we are still making mistakes in that. We are still learning there and realizing it, and it's a paradox, because Sweden, I think, is a very globalized country. We have a very globalized industry. We had that much earlier than you had. I mean, Swedish industry was dependent on international trade. Trade issues have never been controversial from the point of view of the left, really, tradition in Sweden. It's been a left issue on the left that we have to have foreign trade. This outsourcing is not a theme that will catch on in the way it does here. But at the same time, in this organized form that we are part of and this is not primarily an issue if we should send troops here and there. We should to a certain extent. But it's this, we have to give our instruments to a larger group, and I think that's, of course, why the EU developments are so important for us.
And what form does that take? I mean, is it in terms of intelligence cooperation? Obviously, you mentioned feeling this common threat if Madrid is attacked. But I'm curious, does it embed you more deeply in Europe's way of seeing the problem, which I think is different from the United States?
Yeah, and this is one of our complications, because I think the Swedish public opinion and the government has said that, okay, we are not, NATO membership is not in the cards. That's still, there are tensions about that, even with this basic pro-Americanism culturally that we have in the north of Europe. And in one way we are more Anglo-Saxon in our orientation than continental. But when it comes to security, there is a fear of getting. But we have said that we are now totally into the European structures. And I think one of our roles will be, paradoxical roles for Sweden will be, well, there are two things. One is not paradoxical, that maybe we will try to push for the soft power aspects, even if Europe has to get its military act together. But I mean, I think the soft power instruments, and that we are relatively good at, that we will have to contribute them in the larger context. And but the other paradoxical aspect is that I think we in the North, those who are NATO members and those of us who are not, like the Finns and the Swedes, will, with the new Baltic states and other things, will have to work to get the transatlantic contacts in order again, because I think the concern for U.S. presence in Europe and openness in contacts, I think, is probably stronger in the North, regardless of our NATO membership or not, than in some other parts of Europe. And I think we could have an interesting cooperation between the Baltic states, now both members of NATO and EU, former Soviet members, Poland, and I mean these countries that Secretary Rumsfeld called New Europe. We have old Europe, the northern part of old Europe, Germany, and then we have the Scandinavians. And I think maybe we could contribute something together, both realizing that our future is in developing the European Union, making enlargement work, but at the same time upholding the relationship with the US, not uncritically.
So that in a way the British example is a good one for you in the sense of trying to find a middle way between the United States and Europe on the one hand, maybe not taking the exact form that the British took, namely in supporting the war and providing a military contingent. So what is the politics of that in Sweden?
I think also there is emotionally, I think it's easier. You are right in the sense, I think Swedes feel close to the Brits in many ways.
Yeah.
And I mean, also this is also a cultural thing, I mean, with language and everything like that. So I think it's, and of course we in Sweden have shared the hesitancy of the euro with the Brits, perhaps for different reasons. I think, but of course there is skepticism that the Blair administration has been so close to the Bush administration on this, and of course we don't share the view of the Iraqi developments or something like that. But the idea seen in Britain that you have to get the Americans keep the relationship going, which I think many in Europe basically realize anyhow. But I think it's probably a little stronger. And also on the margin, of course, part of it is that going back to our proud history, or less proud history of great power status, we have always had this tension with the Russians, regardless of if this was Tsarist Russia or Communist Soviet Union. We are still very nervous about what's happening in Chechnya and with press freedom in Russia, and is democracy really getting on? I mean, because we will never be totally at ease with Russia, and in that case we think having the Americans in the vicinity is a better thing than relying on Paris. That's quite true.
Now, what about Sweden has a long commitment to multilateral processes,
That's right.
and not here. I'm not talking about Europe, but I'm talking about the UN.
That's right.
And it is a place for a small state to realize its idealism and its foreign policy goals. That's another layer that has to be added here, because not only do you want to be tied to Europe and not untied from the United States, but you also want to further the mechanisms that come with multilateral legitimacy and processes. Really.
Oh yes, and of course that's why we have had these problems with, to put it mildly, with the Iraqi war. But it's interesting in this aspect. You asked the question that the Swedish foreign minister at the time, the late Anna Lindh, who was tragically assassinated last September, dying on September 11 of all days last year, was supportive of the military build-up as long as there was a chance for a Security Council resolution based on the findings of the inspections, the inspectors, of course, then led by Sweden, I mean, talking about our commitment to multilateralism, it was only when it was clear that the Brits and the Americans with the Brits were going to go it alone, disregarding the Security Council, and when there were new reports from the inspectors that the WMD were there, that Sweden said that this is the wrong policy. We did not oppose the build-up and the first phases like the Germans did, for example. There's a great difference there. I remember the Swedish Prime Minister being extremely critical of his fellow Social Democratic colleague, Chancellor Schröder, early February, coming back from Berlin, say, I don't know what they are talking about. I can't understand their policies, which was quite remarkable. So, I mean, we have been able, we accepted the Afghanistan, the Sweden officially accepted the Afghan invasion since it was based on the Security Council protocol. And of course there will always be a tension between a superpower and a small power on this. And we will all, but I think, and of course some people in Sweden now also say that we have been too committed to the UN, and the UN is not a very efficient organization. There are many things that are true in that, but basically I think multilateralism is essential for a country of Sweden. I would even say this is rather jokingly that it's surprising with our problems with the EU membership, where we are not very federalist, if you are familiar with this discussion, which is very European, and hasn't caught fire here at all in the US, probably for good reasons. But anyhow, Sweden is very intergovernmental, not ceding sovereignty that much to the Commission, and there could be good reasons for this. It's non-accountable bureaucracy and things like that. But otherwise, if you are into multilateralism, of course, you have to concede sovereignty, and we have conceded sovereignty to the UN. We can accept military decisions taken by the Security Council. And I think that what's interesting now is that we have seen the Security Council improving the last 10 years, definitely. And I think there are very interesting developments in that, which the US also should see. I mean, when we are talking about sovereignty, and the US blames the UN for rather abusive states stressing their sovereignty, and which prevents things from happening. Of course, we have the problem of the US being so sensitive to its own sovereignty as well. I mean, if you want to be a little, perhaps not fair, but I mean, for the sake of argument, saying that sovereignty is upheld by failed states, failed warlords in failed states, or those dominating failed states, some rogue states, abusive states, and then unfortunately by the only superpower. And of course, that's a little ironic.
I hear you saying, and I want to make sure that's right, that the superpower, the United States, if it were more subtle in its policies, and subtlety, with subtlety goes patience and perseverance, that it has more friends than it has when its policies are not subtle and impatient.
Yes, in one way, of course, it's a very simple point, but I think that it's true. I think that if we now talk about the US-European rivalry, or whatever it is, to me, it's very hard to see that is of a fundamental nature, that we will really fight one another out. Of course, not in a military sense, but even, I mean, there are differing interests, there could be differing business interests and fights, but of course, we are in this together. I mean, the American dream was basically its European dream that has turned universal in one way. But in order for this to work, of course, the superpower also has to make some compromises and concessions, and the problem that many of us have had with the Bush administration is, of course, at least the rhetoric is there. I mean, maybe another administration would be rather similar, but in a modern world, where you don't control policy in the way you could do domestically before, and maybe you put some of the push buttons according to Keynesian economic scheme, and you get certain results when it comes to inflation and growth and employment. The world doesn't work that way. In the modern world, of course, in politics, I mean, this kind of personal styles, contacts, networking, openness in discussion, trust in people becomes even more important. And that's why these style issues, even if structurally many positions would remain regardless of the administrations in this country, I think they are extremely important for how we perceive things. And that's what makes us so worried today, in addition to the situation the actual situation in Iraq as it develops.
Well, one final question: how do you think Sweden will have to change its views, its processes in dealing with this post 9/11 world, or is it very well positioned to offer a unique contribution to solutions to some of these problems?
I think it's decently positioned to do something. What I'm worried about with my own countries, I think we have been rather passive the last few years. And there are many of the things that we try to do in mediation, new ideas, that we thought was part of our independent position in between, that we are not pursuing. I think the great activists that I am impressed by at the moment have been Norway and Canada. They are both NATO members, but they are more active with new ideas, mediating ideas, and also ideas that are critical to the US in many ways than we are, who said that because we haven't found our way in working in a new multilateral setting, or even if we conceive ourselves as multilateralists. As I said, we are not consistent in our commitment to the EU, and we are also we have to be more open with our relationship with the US. And then I don't think NATO membership is the relevant, most important issue, but we haven't really. It's a great challenge for us to pursue our traditional idealism in a new context, where the EU is the first context, where we have to have a much more wholehearted commitment. And I'm sure we can do that also upholding or perhaps even improving the transatlantic link, and perhaps helping the EU to do that, and paradoxically enough, not being the NATO member.
Well, on that positive note, Dr. Mellbourn, I want to thank you very much for coming to Berkeley for the Pay Their Say Their Symposium, and also for being a guest on our program. Thank you very much.
The honor is all mine. It was great to be here, and it is great to come to this part of the US especially.
Very good, very good. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.